The sound came first, metal scraping against metal. A slow, deliberate twist of iron in a lock, echoing through the stone corridors of a house that smelled of oil and silence. That sound meant something final, something irreversible. For the women of 14th century Europe, it was not just a key, it was a sentence. The law called it jus correctionis, the right of correction, a husband's right to discipline his wife. The words were clean, precise, and legal, but the reality was not. In the town ledgers of Avignon and Prague, there are records, so calmly written, that detail the purchase of iron girdles. These were not the chastity belts of legend, no. They were instruments of restraint, devices of humiliation and control, forged not by monsters but by craftsmen, sold with receipts. Every woman knew the sound, the turning key, the closing of breath inside a cage. It began as a gesture of correction. A scolding turned to a slap, the slap to confinement, confinement to invention. The church called it a husband's loving discipline. The magistrates nodded, the neighbors looked away. And yet the women endured. They learned the rhythm of the house, the timing of the key, the flicker of his shadow across the candlelight, the distance between footsteps and the turn of the lock. Every sound became a survival code. For the husbands, it was something else entirely. The girdle was an idea of order, a symbol of control made tangible. Once locked, it was proof that their home was pure, that sin was contained, that obedience had shape and sound. The sound of the key was power itself. But there was one man whose obsession with control went far beyond the law. His name was Etienne de Castelnau, a minor nobleman from Gascony, educated, polite. His letters to the bishop survive to this day, pages filled with prayers for purity, virtue, and silence. He believed that his wife, Aveline, was a vessel of temptation sent to test his faith. He wrote, "If the soul may be cleansed by pain, then the husband is priest, judge, and surgeon of the home." That was the moment when piety became pathology. Aveline was locked in her girdle on the first day of Lent. It was polished steel, lined with brass thorns where the edges met her skin. Etienne kept the key on a chain around his neck. Every morning he turned it slowly, listening to the sound as if it were prayer. Neighbors remembered her voice fading over the weeks, until there was nothing left but the sound of that turning key. Learned helplessness. That was the term modern psychologists would later give it. The moment when pain becomes expected, when resistance dies, when a mind begins to build a prison inside itself. For Aveline, each turn of the lock was another lesson in surrender, but even silence has a breaking point. One night Etienne found the girdle hanging open, blood dried on the clasp. The bed empty. Only the key remained, still around his neck, and yet the lock undone. To this day the chronicles say she vanished, but the villagers whispered another ending, that a man had been found wandering the fields days later, muttering her name, eyes torn blind by something sharp, as if a crown of metal had been forced upon him. The church called it divine punishment. The magistrate called it madness. But in that house, behind those cold walls, the servants swore they could still hear it, every night at the same hour. The sound of a key turning in an invisible lock. Because cruelty, once given form, does not end when the door opens. It echoes, it lingers, it waits for new hands. Now, let us begin. In the next part, the story spreads beyond one household. Across kingdoms and courts, the iron girdle becomes a weapon of law, a ritual of obedience, and the quiet machinery of sanctioned cruelty. By the turn of the 14th century, jus correctionis was no longer whispered. It was written, signed, sealed, endorsed by royal courts and papal scribes who spoke of domestic sanctity. Every parchment carried the same chilling line. A husband may chastise his wife moderately for her correction and the preservation of order. That word, moderately, was the mask that cruelty wore. It allowed anything, so long as the husband called it correction. Across France, the Low Countries, and the German states, the iron girdle became a symbol not of shame, but of virtue. Merchants sold them in open markets. Blacksmiths offered custom engravings. Bible verses, family crests, even blessings from local priests. The sound of the key turning in the lock became the anthem of moral order. The neighbors would hear it and say nothing. To interfere was to question God's structure itself. But behind every closed door, a theater of suffering unfolded in silence. Records from Bruges tell of Margaretha van Doorn, locked for 9 weeks. When her husband finally opened the girdle, her skin had fused to the iron. She didn't scream. She only asked for water. He said she no longer needed it, and the law agreed. The strangest part was how easily the cruelty was hidden inside the ordinary. A husband buying oil for hinges, a servant polishing the clasps, a priest blessing a new lock before a wedding. Each act looked normal until you listened to the sound beneath it, the slow, measured scrape of control tightening. What made just correctionis so monstrous was not its brutality, but its logic. It was the belief that pain purified, that obedience could be engineered through fear. The husband saw himself not as a tormentor, but as a craftsman of morality, refining his wife's soul through the precision of suffering. Modern psychology calls it moral sadism, the fusion of righteousness and cruelty, where punishment becomes proof of love. The husband hurts not because he is angry, but because he believes he is right. That belief was unstoppable. In London, 1368, a jurist named Henry de Bracton published On the Laws and Customs of England. In it, he quietly reaffirmed the husband's right to correction, calling the home a small kingdom where the wife's body is subject to her husband's justice. Justice. The word echoes even now, cold and beautiful, like a blade polished clean. One surviving girdle, displayed today in a museum in Nuremberg, still bears a faint engraving across its inner rim. He who loves, locks. The curators never mention the rest of the inscription, almost invisible beneath centuries of rust. But under the right light, a single phrase can still be read, scratched from the inside. The key turns, but I remain. Historians debate whether it was carved by a victim or added later, yet it carries something timeless, a small, desperate message from within the machinery of sanctioned suffering, because that was the genius of jus correctionis. It turned private agony into public virtue. It baptized cruelty in the language of morality. And all of it was perfectly legal. But law is never eternal. It shifts when fear becomes too loud to silence. In 1391, a scandal erupted in Rouen. A nobleman named Allard de Villon, long admired for his piety, was found dead, locked inside his own girdle. The clasp welded shut, the key missing. When the coroner forced the lock open, they found a single strip of parchment tied around his throat. On it, written in his wife's hand, "Let God correct you." The court was silent. The church denounced it as heresy, but among the women who heard the story, whispered through markets and taverns, something changed. For the first time, they saw that the key could turn both ways. That night, across the city, the sound returned. The metallic scrape of locks being tested, of clasps being unfastened, of women taking one breath too long before exhaling. Not all escaped, most did not, but the silence of obedience was cracking, and as it cracked, fear began to shift. Husbands started sleeping with the key beneath their pillows. Some nailed it to the doorpost. Others melted it into the wax of their candles, believing it would keep their power safe. But nothing could stop the change. Because when the law gives cruelty a name, someone will eventually speak it back. And when they do, the order built upon silence begins to burn. The year that followed would see the first rebellion of wives recorded in ecclesiastical law. Quiet, coordinated acts of defiance. Locks broken, doors left open, clergymen forced to choose between scripture and justice. History calls it the doctrine of obedience, but in truth, it was the sound of the key turning in reverse. Next comes the reckoning, when law itself begins to fracture under the weight of its own cruelty. And the line between justice and vengeance disappears. It began quietly, as most collapses do. The old world did not fall in a single night. It rotted from within. The law that had bound wives in silence began to unravel not through revolt or decree, but through madness. By the early 15th century, jus correctionis had become a curse. Husbands who enforced it were haunted by whispers, confessions, and strange accidents. One man, a merchant from Lübeck, claimed he awoke each night to the sound of a key turning beneath his pillow. His wife had been dead for 3 years. Another swore that when he tried to open his chest of coins, he found his keys fused together, blackened by heat, though no fire had touched them. Fear spread faster than reform ever could. Judges began to omit the clause. Priests refused to bless the locks. But the girdles remained, relics of obedience, passed down as heirlooms, hung above hearths like trophies. And still, the sound persisted. The echo of that turning key, haunting the silence between centuries. The chronicles of Rouen record the trial of one woman, Isabeau Montfort, accused of murdering her husband by starvation. Her defense: "He kept me in the girdle. I only returned what was given." The courtroom froze. The judge ordered her stripped and examined for marks of wickedness. But when they removed her clothing, they found scars so symmetrical that one physician fainted. Thin, dark ridges traced her waist and thighs, as if she had been molded by the device itself. Yet her eyes were calm. She said nothing until the verdict was read. Death by hanging. Then she smiled and said only, "Let him hear the lock." When they took her to the gallows, every hinge on the scaffold jammed. The rope snapped twice. Witnesses swore the air itself stank of iron. Afterward, a strange panic gripped the city. Husbands began discarding their keys, throwing them into rivers, burying them under church floors, sealing them inside walls. The sound of locks turning became a bad omen, and slowly, terribly slowly, the practice faded. But the psychological scar it left would endure for generations. Because jus correctionis was never just about pain, it was about transformation. It taught obedience by erasing choice, reshaping the human mind until submission felt like safety. This is what modern scholars call learned helplessness, a condition where repeated suffering convinces the victim that escape is impossible. Even when the door stands open, the body does not move. The soul waits for the key. That was the true legacy of the iron girdle, not the metal, not the scars, but the silence that followed, a silence that lasted centuries. In time, Europe would forget the name jus correctionis. The laws would be rewritten, the language softened, the instruments hidden in vaults. But listen closely to history, to ritual, to marriage vows whispered beneath stained glass, and you can still hear it. The promise of obedience, the hint of control, the faint ghostly turn of a key in an unseen lock. The archives hold one final account, dated 1423. A widow in Lyon was found dead beside a river, her hands folded neatly across her chest. Around her waist, the remains of an old iron clasp, its lock rusted open. In her hand, a key. The note beneath her body read, "He is gone, but I still turn it." No one ever claimed the body. No one ever found the husband. The case was closed as suicide, but the chronicler wrote a single line in the margin. Perhaps it was not the husband who died. And that was how the story ended. The law fell. The practice vanished. Yet every time power dresses itself in righteousness, every time obedience is called love, the lock begins to turn again. Because history is not a straight line, it's a circle. And the sound of the key, that quiet metallic whisper, still waits in the dark. Perhaps you hear it now. So ask yourself, what price do we still pay for power today? If this descent through forgotten cruelty unsettled you, remember, history does not stay buried. It hides behind our words, our laws, our habits. And the only way to silence the echo is to listen to it first. Subscribe to Crimson Archive for more stories the world tried to forget. The lock has turned. The next key awaits.